Thank you, dear chairs. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I think it was defined I have no disclosures. My study is to study the prevalence of urinary incontinence in the developing world and developing countries. The urinary incontinence, as you all know, is a global issue that has a major effect on patients and people in different aspects. And the prevalence of urinary incontinence is different and varies widely in different countries. So the ICS and IUGA joint report on terminology of pelvic floor dysfunctions defines UI as complaint of loss of urine. So as I mentioned, the prevalence rate varies in different countries. Some of the major things that are responsible for this issue is the various definitions, is the target populations, study characteristics, assessment tools, response rates, age groups, gender, and the health systems that influence the patients. Our main aim in this study was to have an assumption of one single prevalence in the developing countries, and to also assess the prevalence of the subtypes of urinary incontinence, the stress, urge, and mixed urinary incontinence. And also, we wanted to measure some of the issues that influence each of these matters. Our inclusion criteria was all women who lived in developing countries. We didn't have an age limit. And all adult women. We had a limit for the pediatrics. I mean, we only had adults. Just the conclusion. All related studies should have this outcome as the some of the studies only reported some subtypes. We also included them like the stress or urge, and some of them just had all of them, 2 of them. So we these were the outcomes for our inclusion criteria. And the study designs were retrospective cohorts and cross-sectional studies, and also prospective cohorts. This is the PRISMA chart that shows the vast number of the literature that we searched, and it all came up to the 54 studies that were compatible with our inclusion criteria. And finally, when we were assessing the risk of bias, one study was quite out of the, you see with the red star, one study was quite out of the funnel plot, so we omitted that study. So finally we had 53. This is the meta-analyses of the total prevalence of the studies, and it was 25.7%. And as you can see here, we used the random effect model because we had different populations, different characteristics. So we had a high I2, so we chose to use the random effect in all of our meta-analyses. The prevalence rate of the subtypes are shown here. For stress urinary incontinence, it was 12.6, making it the most prevalent subtype of urinary incontinence, and it was followed by mixed urinary incontinence and urge urinary incontinence, 9.1 and 5.3% respectively. The pooled prevalence for we omitted the elderly section to have another assumption without the elderly for the prevalence. It didn't make much difference. We assumed that because the elderly population is not that much in the developing countries because the population is mostly young, so this might have not had a major influence as we can see in some other studies. Oh, and we also subgroup analyzed these based on the definition. Most of them use the same definition of ICS and IUGA, any involuntary loss of urine. The next one was any experience of urine loss or urine leakage in last 4 weeks, and it was also 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and some of them didn't describe it. But it was different in different groups, and it was 33% in the ones that said 4 weeks, loss of urine 4 weeks, but we didn't find logical relations between like the definitions because it wasn't based on what we assumed. The recall thing that most of the people think that recall might have some influence, but it wasn't like this in our study. This is the geographical distribution. We use the World Bank, the WHO sections of the world distributions, and as you can see, it was the most prevalent. The most prevalence was in Middle East and North Africa, 37.3. And our conclusion that I want to make that the definitions and the study types for measuring the prevalence of urinary incontinence varies widely in different countries, and it is necessary for all of it to come together for a single methodology to make it more homogeneous, to have a clear assumption of such an important issue and such a prevalent issue in the developing countries. Thank you very much, and this is the Tabriz Bazaar, so I wish you can visit it anytime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Mustafa, for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
One reflection is that Linda and myself, we have been involved in the ICI book in the epidemiology chapter for quite a number of years, and we have had literature based on developed countries.
Yes.
So we really appreciate that there now is a wealth of data from developing countries, which we believe is extremely important. So congratulations on doing this review. Thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Mohammed Hamadi from London.
Please.
Did you find that there is underreporting of urinary incontinence in the Middle East or developing countries because of cultural issue?
Yes.
Because we found that quite a lot actually in these studies.
Yes, that was an assumption, but when it comes to, yes, that was a theoretical thing that we assumed when we were doing the study because of the shame and some issues, especially in some countries. But the thing was that in some countries that had some issues, some cultural issues that we assumed, the prevalence was very high, and in the other countries, the same issues, the prevalence was very low. We assumed that, but we didn't find something statistically meaningful to show that.
You had a very important slide showing the how complex it is to do these assessments. You have different assessment tools, and you also have, as mentioned here, cultural differences.
Yes.
Would you care to speculate what the differences that you showed on the world map? They're quite substantial differences. Having read the literature, do you have any beliefs what the differences are due to? Is it cultural differences? Is it obstetric practice, or what is it?
I think I want to emphasize again the conclusion we made.
Yeah.
Because the results that we got, we couldn't make, because even in some countries, like there were, Turkey had most of, and China, these were these countries with most of prevalence studies. Like I think it was 20 studies in Turkey. Actually, some of them didn't come in our inclusion criteria, but even in those studies in the same countries, the prevalence had much differences. But I think the most important thing, we think the most important thing is to give a questionnaire that is valid for all of these studies, and to use the same methodology to show that, to decrease the bias and show that what is the real thing that makes the difference.
But I think terminology is also an issue, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Because they don't use the common language. Last question.
Stelios Demokis from London. Did you find some systematic error or differences across the different study designs? Because that would highlight further the need for developing the core outcome sets in reporting in such trials.
Yes, but the studies, I haven't brought our chart for risk of bias, but these studies were luckily overall had good quality of studies, because we had two groups, These were studies by two groups, and we had the final assumption was that the overall studies are okay to enter our inclusion criteria. There were some studies, but it wasn't that major to be omitted in our inclusion criteria.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.